Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. In this episode, I featured Darryl Westly. He received his BFA from the Cooper Union in 2014. Upon graduation, Darryl began an apprenticeship at the Jeff Koons studio, concluding in 2016, whereupon he participated in the Beirut Art Residency Program in Beirut, Lebanon. His solo presentations include A Dream Deferred at 1969 Gallery in New York, Interior-Exterior at the ParisTexasLA Gallery in LA. Darryl's group exhibitions include Every Day is Sunday at UTA Artist Space in Beverly Hills, California, Animal Kingdom at Alexander Berggruen Gallery in New York, Vanquishing Ocular, curated by Salle and Nicole Wittenberg, Rental Gallery, East Hampton, and Ways to Die by the Bruce High Quality Foundation. Darryl's collections include the Rema Hort Foundation, the Portland Museum of Art, the Fidelity Collection, among many others. This June, Darryl will show work as part of Skin Plus Masks, a group exhibition at Kavi Gupta curated by Vic Mensa. Darryl currently lives and works in New York City. Welcome to this episode of the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast featuring Darryl Westly. Darryl, welcome to my Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast.
Thank you, Phyllis. It's such a pleasure. I'm really excited to talk to you. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of your podcast, so it's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much. So tell us, when did you discover your interest in visual arts?
I would say it was really kind of, I think, a cross-pollination between growing up in Chicago, in Hyde Park, which was a very kind of culturally and ethnically diverse neighborhood. And my parents being actively involved in different, very creative circles. I was able to be exposed to a lot of different creative people of all walks of life, Black, white, what have you. And seeing these different kind of ways in which people operate, in which people move, and communication being a huge part of the way in which my father kind of moved throughout the world as a reporter, really got me interested in terms of the way in which people can go and kind of communicate their experiences and how I could communicate my own. So in a way, it was really, I'd say sort of more literary arts that really informed me growing up. And as I kind of started to look towards different things such as satire, comics, newspaper comics, my dad had this huge comic collection, just spread from when he was a kid into when basically I was a teenager. So 30, 40 years, I would go and read all these different comic books. And all of a sudden this kind of I would kind of start to have this interest in terms of the way in which language can go and communicate with image. And Chicago being a city full of amazing institutions such as the Art Institute and things like that, eventually as I went into high school, I was able to kind of explore these different kind of in parts of art with a capital A, and slowly but surely starts to bridge these different worlds together.
Did you start drawing comic books?
I started drawing comic books. I would read comics like Brenda Starr or Calvin and Hobbes, and then Spider-Man was a big inspiration and stuff like that when I was younger. And also, like, there was this book, I want to say it was like Dardigan's Illustrated Greek Mythology. And the idea of kind of like marrying these different sort of like stories, oftentimes dealing with like, integrity or these different kind of like, or tragedy, these different kind of ideas like justice or whatnot, was this really, I think, interesting way of like kind of starting to create a motivation as to like what art and how art can kind of exist within like socially. So I think for me, there's always been like a kind of a social aspect to like, what's been interesting in art in terms of like communication and like how you can kind of like art can allow for certain voices to be heard, certain subtle experiences to be like felt or communicated that might not be able to otherwise within like maybe common conversation or everyday life.
So who influenced you early on? What artists?
I'd say one of the first like real like connections I feel like I had with an artist was Rodin. There was this bookstore that was like close to my elementary school that I would go to, and I remember picking up this huge tome just on like Rodin's like work and reading about it and seeing like or reading about his work and kind of like going through like some of his early pieces to like the Berggruen of Calais. I started to sort of have this real interest in terms of biography, in terms of the way in which like an artist kind of goes about their journey building like from an idea. And one of the things that really I remember stuck with me, because I was reading this a lot in high school, I was sort of like starting to decide that I wanted to move out of Chicago, that he said it only takes one work to define an artist, right? Or to kind of like, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that going and trying to give and how much you give to work, when you do that, when you give your all to a piece or something like that, like you're giving it the ability to sort of live and to occupy this place within people's minds or within like, a certain kind of conversation or possibly enter into this conversation with the zeitgeist. And it's something I feel like I've taken to heart in terms of the way that I approach my art, is going and thinking about like what you can give or what I can personally give to each piece of work that I create, that each of them sort of, that every artwork I make is kind of like another ability to go and wrestle with different ideas that maybe I wasn't able to take on within the last work. So
while you're creating, are those thoughts running through your mind? I mean, do you care? Are you concerned about what your audience thinks, what they absorb when they view your work?
I think I tend to try and think about, or to sort of take a step back from the work and kind of, ultimately it starts with what I would like to see. And when I'm considering that, I'm trying to go and like the questions I'm kind of pondering for myself in terms of what I want to see is like, well, what's exciting? Like what are things that, like a certain kind of balance between, formal concerns, and as well as like in terms of like imagery. And at times like, I have a certain attraction to whether it be like allegory or the way in which a painting can kind of also function as like a means of looking at and understanding visual imagery within a different way. And it's something that I really started to think a lot about in high school and also going to college, was in terms of the way in which like the internet started to breach this certain kind of like connection or this certain kind of like new language in terms of like how we go and understand communication. That with text messaging and things like AIM and whatnot, like the way in which we would type letters or the way in which you would use certain things such as a period or exclamation mark, or the way in which imagery would go and deteriorate or be high res would be indicative of certain ideas of like high and low, or high quality images, or being indicative of like, a high speed computer, which would also mean like maybe, access to wealth or access to good technology, and low quality images being something else. And depending on what the imagery is itself, we're dealing with all these different modifiers. So when I think about painting, I'm also thinking about these different experiences going back into me growing up in Chicago, where Hyde Park, though it was this kind of cultural bastion in and of itself, was surrounded by ghettos. And you were always held within these sort of like this high relief up against the other different sides of Chicago, which would be the west side, the south side, the north side. And the north side always being like, attributed to wealth, whereas the south side generally, outside of somewhere such as Hyde Park, would be attributed with like poverty. And I think growing up like that, and I think this is also, relatively symbolic or relatively common to, I think, the African-American experience, or at least the inner city African-American experience in general, you're very aware of these different class modifiers and things. And that sensitivity at times, I think, creates this interest in terms of going and thinking about communication and code switching and these other different ways in which we kind of have to navigate the world. But I think also allows for a deep sense of empathy through the need at times for assimilation and connection.
Are those memories reflected in your work?
I start with photography because I think one of the things that photography allows for is this connection to reality. And, I think in terms of and going into the literary idea of that, it's great fiction is written from experience, felt or lived, because there is that underlying moment of life. I like to think of photography as a way to go and inform and to draw upon the different ways in which it can evoke memories or experiences, but then those experiences are almost to a certain extent, this other medium outside of the pain itself that allows me to go and create these different sort of experiences within each work.
Define your practice for us. What materials do you use?
It's a process. I would say it's essentially it's a process-based way that ultimately culminates within oil painting, but uses different forms of digital media such as photography, digital image manipulation, and drawing to then go and create these studies that then go and become the basis for which I go and create paintings. A lot of my practice, I'm thinking about how to go and rectify or sort of take images or experiences or feelings that at times can feel complex, if not convoluted, especially in regards to current events or different kinds of ideas like leisure and excess, and to more or less kind of coalesce those and kind of bring them together into a larger kind of conversation about both my personal identity, but also the American experience, and particularly contemporary American experience in terms of going and understanding ourselves in relativity to the history of America, where America stands today within a global kind of economy, and what it kind of looks like going forward in terms of what the world can be now that we're connected through things such as the internet.
How did COVID impact you?
COVID impacted me in a number of ways. I think it actually went and allowed for a lot of the way in which I work, which is using digital imagery to really be able to resound in a way that was even more impactful. As a result of that, so many people were being restricted to the screen as a way of going and receiving information or understanding experiences. I would use in a lot of different of my works, especially works prior to 2020, to go and kind of comment on different ideas of leisure and things like that, was travel magazines. Because for me, I felt that it was interesting seeing how my understanding of certain kind of locales or locations was very much colored by the way in which they would be what was presented through a search engine or what was presented through a issue of Condé Nast Traveler or Travel and Leisure. And how areas like the Caribbean and things like that would always be beaches. Whereas if you were looking at a city like Amsterdam or, London, it was institutions and, places of great learning. And how that would go and color these different kind of ideas. It's like of what someplace had to offer. It's like, I can't learn anything if I go to the Caribbean, and I only like spend my time in a library if I go to London, and how that goes and creates these different ideas of what we see and how we understand ourselves through media. So that being said, like with things such as George Floyd and the marches here in New York, and the way in which social media and hashtags and things like that really became this major way in which people started to understand themselves as part of communities or just separate from certain communities, or as a means of like self-expression, the screen became one of the most important ways in which we could go about affirming our allegiance to a flag or away from it.
Do you listen to music while you work?
I do. I mean, occasionally, actually. I mean, it's like sometimes I'll choose to just work in silence. And then other times it's something which I'll go and do, particularly when I feel like there's a need to kind of like to disrupt. Like, I think music, especially like, now recently, like, if I'm going and playing music, like a friend of mine has this playlist that he sent me, which is essentially, for the most part, is sort of like almost like trance music. And there's no lyrics for the most part. And it's just like sort of beats, which sort of like go and build over like, the course of a number of minutes. And I think that at this particular point, when I'm in the studio, it's like I think it's really important to be present within like the work and how I'm kind of like shifting around the process of the paint, or like the paint on the painting and things like that, which allows for me to go and then consider like different choices, as opposed to sometimes I think music can be a color in and of itself, where I could be lost within the music rather than focusing on the act of painting itself.
So you don't listen to music while you paint?
Not often. I mean, like it's something that, I'll vacillate between.
So you want all your senses to focus on your work?
Yeah, I think the idea of being present is something that's like, I think really important, I think, in terms of decision making. And that's, again, kind of why I kind of describe the work as being process based, is that it is these different decisions. And prior to the pandemic, I sort of had this moment when I was at this friend's studio where I had a lot of things I was sort of like trying to juggle at the time. I was dealing with a bunch of different just like responsibilities, both personally and work related, and kind of had this epiphany where it was just like, I remember saying to my friend, I was like, I need to control the painting. I can't let the painting control me. And one of the things, and what that really was going and thinking about in terms of that informing or letting a certain kind of process, like in relativity to the work, whether that be like the creation of a study that then goes and forms the painting itself, to go and have so much power over the final work that it would become almost too piecemeal or too much of a sort of like system of like mechanical reproduction, as opposed to something of allowing each stage of the work to really go and inform and truly like the actual like gestalt, and finding a wedding between each of these different forms or these different steps of the process.
How do you keep learning?
I think one of the beautiful things about being in New York is that, you can almost be like a radio station, like you can tune your receivers so that, you don't hear anything but static. But if you want, just walking outside, you can just go and enter into a whole nother universe. You walk into a bar, you walk into a coffee shop, and all of a sudden you hear this person with a story that you never would have imagined, and just, and if you can allow yourself to empathize and to walk into that, you can learn and have so much to explore. I think that at this particular moment, I've been thinking a lot in terms of like different kind of techniques of painting, and different ways of like dealing with like the surface of the painting, or what surface in and of itself, and allowing myself to kind of go and really just have the time to go and experiment. I think one of the things that I like to, consider is just pressing the restart button and letting new things kind of like flow in and flow out, which is really a wonderful experience.
And what are you excited about now?
Quite a few things. I mean, I'd say like coming out of COVID, hopefully, or as we or rather lockdown, I think that there's a lot of really interesting conversations that are now happening within the world at large in regards to not only art, but also space and what space means, like considering that, we're coming into this, this reopening, and how coveted things such as public parks and things like that were prior to the pandemic, or during the pandemic rather. I think there's almost going to be a new kind of pastoralism that we're going to be interested in, entering into, because New York has almost taken on this new kind of meaning as well too. Like the people that stayed here when nothing was accessible had these really particular ideas and these really particular passions about what New York was, not only during the lockdown, but what it could be. And I think part of that has to deal with a certain amount of legacy and understanding that as people living within the city, or let alone just as people ultimately, we're ultimately the executors or the arbiters of the change that we want to see. And we saw that firsthand as being possible through such things as George Floyd and, the Black Lives Matter movement, and, conversely, January 6th, that if you want to be heard, it's possible to be heard. And I think that's something that for many people didn't seem like it could be a reality until prior to the pandemic.
How would you define Black art?
It's funny. I mean, I realized that evidently Trevor Noah had made a joke about this or something recently, or maybe not so recently, but remember just saying this unbeknown or unawares of that, saying that, it's fascinating how African American is a phrase that's used that refers to an entire continent, whereas we have Italian American, French American, countries, right? But there's this idea of sort of that Blackness is this monolith, and oftentimes that monolith is directly related to class. And I think Black art deals particularly with certain ideas of class, because I think that's generally how we're able to go and define Blackness in and of itself within America. That it's very difficult to define African American Black without thinking of inner city poverty or generational disparity. And so what I think is particularly interesting in going is that Black art, I think, is actually something that exists within this constant place of being redefined, because our relationship and our understanding of Blackness as a country is constantly changing, just as much as how the reaction or understanding of Black Lives Matter changed within a course of 6 months. So I think Black art is a term that loosely has been used in the past, I think, to very much try and create a certain kind of narrowness. When we think about the ways in which certain artists and things like that were kind of cast, whether it be Norman Lewis or earlier artists of say the Harlem Renaissance or whatnot, Elizabeth Catlett, as a means of going and subjecting and kind of limiting artists, as opposed to how I feel it exists now, which is an idea of trying to encapsulate a connection to a certain kind of sociological kind of condition. I think when I was younger, when I was growing up, I felt the term Black art was something that was also used as a pejorative, because it would oftentimes go and be associated with the idea of outsider art, where it would be naive art or something. It's because much of what would be presented within like, what I would see, or, in terms of like within certain kind of like institutions or things like that, which would be pushed forward as quote unquote Black art, was either art that was literally from Africa, or it was art that was like, for instance, like, work that would be going and reference, like would be using like certain kind of like aesthetics that would be that without knowledge of their employment, like whether that be like, sort of like minimalist aesthetics or generally like abstract aesthetic, and not without an awareness of art canon or European art canon. So whereas I think the way Black art is used now is as an idea of a conversation, and a conversation with Black art, which I think is very important and very exciting.
It is an exciting time. It really is. And I've enjoyed this episode, this interview very much. At one point, I used to ask my guests two separate questions. One was, what do you feel is the purpose of art? And then I would ask the question, what do you feel is your role as an artist? But it should be one question, because artists create for a number of different reasons. So I'm going to ask you the question. This is our final question. What do you feel is the purpose of art, and what is your role as an artist?
In many ways, I think art is a mirror. And I think of myself as an eye, and holding that eye open even when my lids get heavy, I think is part of what I not only find engaging about an artist, but the most important. And I think the challenge of not looking away, but I think when we look at something, sometimes we can look with anger, other times we can look with empathy. And I think finding that balance between the role that we wish to play, and for me to be able to understand and to care, that at the end of the day, to look upon something is to consider it. And that, I think, is caring. And that, I think, is what's important and what I wish to continue doing.
Well, I found you on Instagram because I was attracted to what you're doing. I love your paintings, and I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.